The point of the talk today is threefold. The first part is to raise awareness on environmental sustainability and the problems facing our world, and more specifically the Imarat, how we can, what are the problems with environmental sustainability. The second part is talking about the opportunity. Where is there opportunity to make our country and our world more sustainable? And the third part is what you can do specifically to make a difference. Starting with the first part, we'll talk about our resources. Now, resources that we talk about here are threefold. We have electricity, energy, water, and waste. Waste is a resource that we'll talk about in just on a high level. To get us started, we should know that climate change is a reality. It's not something that is just in science fiction, it's something that's fact. We see changes in our environment across the world. 2010 was the hottest year ever recorded. The decade from 2000 to 2010 was the hottest decade ever. We see increasing natural disasters, that a lot of them are as a result of climate change. Scientists say that hurricanes will increase in intensity, not necessarily in number, and this is a result of the increasing temperature of the oceans and of the world. Climates will be more severe, so not just will you have floods, but you also have droughts. The sea level is rising, and that's a result of melting glaciers between 1941 and 2004, and you can see the decrease in the actual ice, which is a direct result of global warming. That's going to happen. Sea levels are going to rise, increased flooding. A lot of natural disasters are going to happen as a result of climate change and global warming. Now, just as a note from the sea level increase, the Imarat could be 6% underwater by 2100 by some estimates. This means that Abu Dhabi would be practically wiped off. As you can see over here, simulations of if the sea level were to rise by their estimates by 2100, Abu Dhabi and Dubai would be practically wiped off. So what causes climate change? The main result is greenhouse gases, right? So how does that happen? Now, greenhouse gases are naturally emitted in our Earth, the planet. You have a variety of different sources. A lot of them are natural, so you have plant growth, plant decay. Some of them are sinks, some of them are sources of greenhouse gases. The sinks accept the greenhouse gases and remove them from the atmosphere, and the sources emit them. But the major tipping point is the greenhouse gases that are not natural, and those are the ones that we are emitting. Now, a third of the greenhouse gases are emitted because of land change, the way we use our land, and 2/3 are actually as a result of other effects, be it electricity in cars, etc., etc. So a third from land and 2/3 from other factors. So how are the greenhouse gases changing throughout the past few hundred years? This graph shows it quite clearly. A few of the greenhouse gases shown over here, carbon dioxide, methane, and the nitrous oxides, you can see them for the past 1,800, and then shooting up as the Industrial Revolution took place, and people had their incredible, great effect on the world. But more interesting is the change in temperature on Earth. And this graph shows about 1,000 years of temperature readings. And again, you can see the increase in the Earth's core temperature over the past few years as a result of climate change. Now, what are the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions? The major one is power. So you can see over here, 21% of greenhouse gases comes from electricity consumption. A lot of them come from industry and transport. So we'll talk a little bit about this later. In terms of the UAE specifically, if we're looking at energy, the UAE has the 3rd highest per capita energy consumption in the world. The UAE, in terms of water, the UAE also has the 3rd highest water consumption per capita in the world. It's second to Canada and the US, but the advantage that the US and Canada have is that their water resources are actually from the earth. They're renewable for the most part. The majority of UAE's water resources are desalinated, which is a very carbon-intensive process. The last thing we want to talk about, so we talked about energy and water, the last thing is waste. This is a picture of a typical landfill. In the Imarat, there is no proper waste management process. They just take the waste and they dump it in landfills. This is a picture of one such landfill. The waste in landfills produces methane gas, which is 23 times more harmful to the environment than CO2. So that also has to be taken into consideration. we're talking about environmental sustainability. It's not just about energy and water, but it's also about waste and what we do with it. The UAE produces 730 kilograms of waste per person per year. I mean, think about that. It's shocking how much waste. It's almost 3/4 of a ton for each one of us every year. And that compares to the UK, which is less than half of that, only 300. Right, so there's something fundamentally wrong with what's happening over here. So let's talk about what is carbon. What is a carbon footprint? And a carbon footprint is simply the greenhouse gas emissions plus all other emissions, be it methane and nitrous oxides, etc., put into equivalent terms of carbon dioxide. So you have one final number, which is your carbon dioxide emissions, which is what we call a carbon footprint. So if you look at in the Emirat, these are the different measures of carbon footprint for your electricity, for water, for waste, just to give you a sense. So what's more interesting is to look at the map across the world and see who are the largest emitters of carbon dioxide in the world. As you can imagine, the largest is the US, China also one of the largest carbon emissions, but the caveat is that they have very large populations. So let's look at that exact same statistic, carbon emissions, but take it on a per person basis. And what sticks out is the Gulf is amongst the worst in the world. Qatar, thankfully, #1, keeping the UAE looking good. The UAE is a third to the Netherlands and T's. It's a small island. It's mainly an energy producer, which is why it's so bad. But you can see a lot of the Gulf countries, Kuwait, Bahrain, etc., amongst the worst in the world in terms of carbon emissions per capita. The important point to note here is the UAE is amongst the worst in the world. Some people say it's the highest, some people say it's right there, but we are amongst the worst in the world. So the question that comes up is why? Right? I want to try and answer this by looking at the situation we're in. Right? We're living in a desert, and there's a reason that the Gulf countries have some of the worst carbon emissions per capita in the world. It is because we are living in a desert. And the desert, we turn green, right? It takes a lot of energy to turn the desert green. Be it from water desalination, be it from cooling that is necessary for just our comfort. If we didn't have this energy, we would not be very comfortable. But the other thing is that the UAE developed very rapidly, right? And you took this place that just 20, 30 years ago had nothing, and you turned it into a metropolis that is green. Now, I'm not saying that development is bad, but what happened with development is that sustainability was not factored in. And there are a lot of other factors that we cannot take into consideration that are a cause of this poor sustainability in the UAE. One of them is abundance. And that is because the UAE has so much natural resources, they never cared to make the most of it and to become efficient. The other one is when you look at cars and buildings. I mean, some of the fastest, some of the biggest cars in the world over here, they're very fuel inefficient. There are no standards, there's no regulation, fuel is cheap. Buildings, electricity is relatively cheap. The University of Sharjah doesn't even pay for electricity. They don't even know how much they spend. And I know this because I talked to them about this, right? So there is no consideration on energy consumption. Nobody cares. So, I mean, how are you supposed to become sustainable if you're not paying for electricity? Now, other factors is consumer behavior, specifically us. How do we make a difference? We'll talk about this a little bit later. And lastly is energy intensity. Energy intensity, what I'm referring to are things that shouldn't necessarily be in the desert, be it snow in the middle of the desert in summer. Not necessarily saying these are all bad, but they're not sustainable. If you want to build crazy things like these, build a solar plant to power them, right? On the whole, just the development that happened here is completely unsustainable, and we need to make a difference to bring it back to something that is sustainable. Before I go on a side note, we talked about carbon footprint. There's another thing called ecological footprint, which I'm not going to touch up on in this presentation, and that is everything that the UAE or country uses, be it from the food imports to everything that is necessary in order to sustain our lives. The UAE has the highest ecological footprint in the world, and the equivalent stat is that the UAE, in order to survive, if all countries in the world were like the UAE, we need 6 planets to keep up. Because practically everything is imported, right? All of our food, everything, it's not a sustainable country.